Letter 9. Dated at Boucherville, October 2, 1685. Being an account of the commerce and trade of Monreal, of the arrival of the Marquis of Denonville with some troops, and of the recalling of Mr. de la Barre, with a curious description of certain licenses for trading in beaver skins in the remote countries. Sir, I received your second letter 3 weeks ago, but could not send a speedier answer, by reason that none of our ships have yet set sail for France. Since you want to know the nature of the trade of Monreal, be pleased to take the following account. Almost all the merchants of that city act only on the behalf of the Quebec merchants whose factors they are. The barks which carry thither dry commodities, as well as wine and brandy, are but few in number, but then they make several voyages in 1 year from the one city to the other. The inhabitants of the island of Monreal and the adjacent cantons repair twice a year to the city of Monreal, where they buy commodities 50% dearer than at Quebec. The savages of the neighboring countries, whether settled or erratic, carry thither the skins of beavers, elks, caribou, foxes, and wildcats, all which they truck for fuses, powder, lead, and other necessaries. There everyone is allowed to trade, and indeed 'tis the best place for the getting of an estate in a short time. All the merchants have such a perfect good understanding one with another, that they all sell at the same price. But when the inhabitants of the country find their prices exorbitant, they raise their commodities in proportion. The gentlemen that have a charge of children, especially daughters, are obliged to be good husbands, in order to bear the expense of the magnificent clothes with which they are set off. For pride, vanity, and luxury reign as much in New France as in Old France. In my opinion, 'twould do well if the king would order commodities to be rated at a reasonable price, and prohibit the selling of gold and silver brocados, fringes, and ribbons, as well as points and rich laces. The Marquis of Denonville is come to succeed Mr. de la Barre in the quality of Governor General, for the king has recalled Mr. de la Barre upon the accusation laid against him by his enemies. To be sure, you who are in France know better than I that Mr. Denonville was maitre de camp to the Queen's regiment of dragoons, which place he sold to Mr. Mercy, when the king bestowed this government upon him, and that he brought with him some companies of marines, besides his lady and his children, for it seems the danger and inconveniencies that attend such a long and troublesome voyage made no impression upon her. This governor stayed at first some weeks at Quebec, after which he came to Monreal, with 500 or 600 men of regular troops, and sent back the captains Hainaut, Montortier, and Duriveau, with several other officers. His army is now in winter quarters, all round Monreal. My quarters are at a place called Boucherville, which lies at the distance of 3 leagues from Monreal. I have been here 15 days, and in all appearance shall live more happily than in the town, abating for the solitude, for at least I shall have no other opposition to encounter in the case of balls, gaming, and feasting, but the zealous freaks of a silly priest. I am informed that the governor has given orders to complete the fortifications of Monreal, and is now ready to embark for Quebec, where our governors commonly pass the winter. The savages I spoke of in my last met the Iroquois upon the great river of the Ottawas, who informed them that the English were making preparations to transport to their villages in Missilimakinac better and cheaper commodities than those they had from the French. This piece of news did equally alarm the gentlemen, the peddlers called coureurs de bois, and the merchants, who, at that rate, would be considerable losers, for you must know that Canada subsists only upon the trade of skins or furs, 3/4 of which come from the people that live round the Great Lakes, so that if the English should put such a design in execution, the whole country would suffer by it, especially considering that would sink certain licenses, an account of which will be proper in this place. These licenses are granted in writing by the governors general to poor gentlemen and old officers who have a charge of children. They are disposed of by the king's orders, and the design of them is to enable such persons to send commodities to these lakes. The number of the persons thus empowered ought not to exceed 25 in 1 year, but God knows how many more have private licenses. All other persons, of what quality or condition soever, are prohibited to go or send to these lakes without such licenses, under the pain of death. Each license extends to the lading of 2 great canoes, and whoever procures a whole or half license for himself may either make use of it himself or sell it to the highest bidder. Commonly they are bought at 600 crowns apiece. Those who purchase them are at no trouble in finding peddlers or forest rangers to undertake the long voyages, which fetch the most considerable gains, and commonly extend to a year, and sometimes more. The merchants put into the 2 canoes stipulated in the license 6 men with 1,000 crowns worth of goods, which are rated to the peddlers at 15%, more than what they are sold for in ready money in the colony. When the voyage is performed, this sum of 1,000 crowns commonly brings in 700% clear profit, and sometimes more, sometimes less, for these sparks, called coureurs de bois, bite the savages most dexterously, and the lading of 2 canoes, computed at 1,000 crowns, is a purchase for as many beaver skin as will load 4 canoes. Now, 4 canoes will carry 160 packs of skins, that is, 40 apiece, and reckoning each pack to be worth 50 crowns, the value of the whole amounts to 8,000 crowns. As to the repartition of this extravagant profit, 'tis made after the following manner. In the first place, the merchant takes out of the whole bulk 600 crowns for the purchase of his license, then 1,000 crowns for the prime cost of the exported commodities. After this, there remains 6,400 crowns of surplusage, out of which the merchant takes 40% for bottomry, which amounts to 5,560 crowns, and the remainder is divided equally among the 6 coureurs de bois, who get little more than 600 crowns apiece, and indeed I must say 'tis fairly earned, for their fatigue is inconceivable. In the meantime, you must remark that over and above the foregoing profit, the merchant gets 25% upon his beaver skins by carrying them to the office of the farmers general, where the price of 4 sorts of beaver skins is fixed. If the merchant sells these skins to any private man in the country for ready money, he is paid in the current money of the country, which is of less value than the bills of exchange that the director of that office draws upon Rochelle or Paris, for there they are paid in French livres, which are 20 sols, whereas a Canada livre is but 15 sols. This advantage of 25% is called le bénéfice, but take notice that 'tis only to be had upon beaver skins, for if you pay to a Quebec merchant 400 Canada livres in silver, and take from him a bill of exchange upon his correspondent in France, his correspondent will pay no more than 300 French livres, which is a just equivalent. This is the last intelligence I shall give you for this year, which has already brought in a very cold autumn. The Quebec ships must set sail in the middle of November, pursuant to the wonted custom. I am, Sir, yours, etc. Letter 10. Dated at Boucherville, July 8, 1686, relating the arrival of Mr. de Champigni in the room of Mr. de Meules, who is recalled to France, the arrival of the troops that came along with him, the curiosity of the Rackets, and the way of hunting Elks, with a description of that animal. Sir, though I have not heard from you this year, yet I will not slight this opportunity of writing to you. Some ships from France are arrived at Quebec, and have brought over Mr. de Champigny Nourou, with some companies of marines. He comes to supply the place of Mr. de Meules, whom the king recalls upon the unjust complaints that are made of him. He is charged with preferring his private interest to the public good, but the charge is false, and he will easily clear himself. I am apt to believe he may have carried on some underhand commerce, but in so doing he injured nobody. Nay, on the contrary, he has procured bread for 1,000 poor creatures that without his assistance would have starved for hunger. This new intendant is descended of one of the most illustrious families of the robe in France. He is said to be a man of honor, and fame entitles his lady to a distinguished merit. I understand he and Mr. Denonville are bound speedily for Monreal, where they mean to take a review of the inhabitants of this island and of the neighboring cantons. Probably they take such precautions in order to some new effort against the Iroquois. Last winter we had no new occurrences in the colony. I spent the whole winter at the hunting of orignals or elks along with the savages, whose language I am learning, as I have intimated to you several times. The hunting of elks is performed upon the snow with such rackets as you see designed in the annexed cut. These rackets are 2.5 feet long and 14 inches broad. Their ledges are made of a very hard wood, about an inch thick, that fastens the net just like a tennis racket, from which they differ only in this, that those for the tennis are made of gut strings, whereas the other are made of little thongs of the skins of harts or elks. In the cut, you may perceive 2 little spars of wood, which run across to render the net firmer and stiffer. The hole that appears by the 2 latchets is the place in which they put the toes and forepart of the foot, so that it's tied fast by the 2 latchets, which run twice around about the heel, and every step they make upon the snow, the forepart of the foot sinks into that hole as often as they raise their heel. By the help of this contrivance, they walk faster upon the snow than one can do with shoes upon a beaten path. And indeed 'tis so necessary for them that 'twould be otherwise impossible not only to hunt and range the woods, but even to go to church, notwithstanding they are so near. For commonly the snow is 3 or 4 foot deep in that country during the winter, being obliged to march 30 or 40 leagues in the woods in pursuit of the above-mentioned animals. I found that the fatigue of the journey equaled the pleasure of it. The orignal is a sort of elk, not much different from that we find in Muscovy. 'Tis as big as an Auvergne moil, and much of the same shape, abating for its muzzle, its tail, and its great flat horns, which weigh sometimes 300 and sometimes 400 weight, if we may credit those who pretend to have weighed them. And this animal usually resorts to planted countries. Its hair is long and brown, and the skin is strong and hard, but not thick. The flesh of the orignal, especially that of the female sort, eats deliciously, and 'tis said that the far hind foot of the female kind is a cure for the falling sickness. It neither runs nor skips, but its trot will almost keep up with the running of a hart. The savages assure us that in summer 'twill trot 3 days and 3 nights without intermission. This sort of animals commonly gather into a body towards the latter end of autumn, and the herds are largest in the beginning of the spring, at which time the she ones are in rutting, but after their heat is over, they all disperse themselves. We hunted them in the following manner. First of all, we went 40 leagues to the northward of the river of St. Lawrence, where we found a little lake of 3 or 4 leagues in circumference, and upon the banks of that lake we made huts for ourselves of the bark of trees, having first cleared the ground of the snow that covered it. In our journey thither, we killed as many hares and wood hens as we could eat. When we had fitted up our huts, the savages went out upon the discovery of the Elks, some to the northward and some to the south, to the distance of 2 or 3 leagues from the huts. As soon as they discovered any fresh footsteps, they detached one of their number to give us notice, to the end that the whole company might have the pleasure of seeing the chase. We traced these footsteps, sometimes for 1 and sometimes for 2 leagues, and then fell in with 5, 10, 15 or 20 elks in a body. which presently betook themselves to flight, whether apart or in a body, and sunk into the snow up to their breast. Where the snow was hard and condensated, or where the frost following wet weather had glazed it above, we came up with them after the chase of a quarter of a league. But when the snow was soft or just fallen, we were forced to pursue them 3 or 4 leagues before we could catch them, unless the dogs happened to stop them where the snow was very deep. When we came up with them, the savages fired upon them with fuses. If the elks be much enraged, they'll sometimes turn upon the savages, who cover themselves with boughs in order to keep off their feet, with which they would crush them to pieces. As soon as they are killed, the savages make new huts upon the spot with great fires in the middle, while the slaves are employed in slaying them and stretching out the skins in the open air. One of the soldiers that accompanied me told me one day that to withstand the violence of the cold, one ought to have his blood composed of brandy, his body of brass, and his eyes of glass. And I must say, he had some ground for what he spoke, for we were forced to keep a fire all round us all the night long. As the flesh of these animals lasts, the savages seldom think of steering. But when 'tis all consumed, they then look out for a new discovery. Thus they continue to hunt till the snow and the ice are melted. As soon as the great thaw commences, 'tis impossible for them to travel far, so that they content themselves with the killing of hares and partridges, which are very numerous in the woods. When the rivers are clear of the ice, they make canoes of the elk skins, which they sew together very easily, covering the seams with a fat sort of earth instead of pitch. This work is over in 4 or 5 days' time, after which they return home in the canoes with all their baggage. This, sir, was our diversion for 3 months in the woods. We took 66 elks, and might have killed twice as many if we had hunted for the benefit of the skins. In the summer season, the savages have 2 ways of killing them, both of which are equally troublesome. One consists in hanging a rope gin between 2 trees, upon a pass surrounded with thorns. The other is compassed by crawling like snakes among the trees and thickets, and approaching to them upon the leeward side, so that they may be shot with a fuse. Harts and caribous are killed both in summer and winter, after the same manner with the elks, excepting that the caribons, which are a kind of wild asses, make an easy escape when the snow is hard, by virtue of their broad feet, whereas the elk sinks as fast as he rises. In fine, I am so well pleased with the hunting of this country, that I have resolved to employ all my leisure time upon that exercise. The savages have promised that in 3 months' time I shall see other sorts of chases, which will prove less fatiguing and more agreeable. I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 11, dated at Boucherville, May 28, 1687, being a curious description of the hunting of diverse animals. Sir, you complain that the last year you received but one of my letters, dated July 8, and with the same breath assure me that you writ 2 to me, neither of which is come to hand. I received a letter from you this day, which is so much the more acceptable, that I thought you had been dead, and that I find you continue to give proof of your remembrance of me. I find by your letter that you have an agreeable relish for the curious elk hunting in this country, and that a further account of our other hunting adventures would meet with a welcome reception. This curiosity indeed is worthy of so great a huntsman as yourself, but at present I must beg your excuse as to the beaver hunting, for I know nothing of it yet but by hearsay. In the beginning of September, I set out in a canoe upon several rivers, marshes and pools that disembarge in the Champlain Lake, being accompanied with 30 or 40 of the savages that are very expert in shooting and hunting, and perfectly well acquainted with the proper places for finding waterfowl, deer, and other fallow beasts. The first post we took up was upon the side of a marsh, or fen, 4 or 5 leagues in circumference, and after we had fitted up our huts, the savages made huts upon the water in several places. These water huts are made of the branches and leaves of trees, and contain 3 or 4 men. For a decoy, they have the skins of geese, bustards, and ducks, dried and stuffed with hay, the 2 feet being made fast with 2 nails to a small piece of a light plank, which floats round the hut. This place being frequented by wonderful numbers of geese, ducks, bustards, teals, and an infinity of other fowl unknown to the Europeans. When these fowls see the stuffed skins swimming with the heads erected, as if they were alive, they repair to the same place, and so give the savages an opportunity of shooting them, either flying or upon the water, after which the savages get into their canoes and gather them up. They have likewise a way of catching them with nets, stretched upon the surface of the water at the entries of the rivers. In a word, we eat nothing but waterfowl for 15 days, after which we resolved to declare war against the turtle doves, which are so numerous in Canada that the bishop has been forced to excommunicate them oftener than once upon the account of the damage they do to the product of the earth. With that view, we embarked and made towards a meadow, in the neighborhood of which the trees were covered with that sort of fowl, more than with leaves. For just then 'twas the season in which they retire from the northern countries and repair to the southern climates, and one would have thought that all the turtle doves upon earth had chose to pass through this place. For the 18 or 20 days that we stayed there, I firmly believe that 1,000 men might have fed upon them heartily, without putting themselves to any trouble. You must know that through the middle of this meadow there runs a brook, upon which I and 2 young savages shot several snipes, rails, and a certain sort of fowl called batteur de faux, which is as big as a quail, and eats very deliciously. In the same place we killed some muskrats, or a sort of animals that resemble a rat in their shape, and are as big as a rabbit. The skins of these rats are very much valued, as differing but little from those of beavers. Their testicles smell so strong of musk that no civet or antelope that Asia affords can boast of such a strong and sweet smell. We spied them in the mornings and evenings, at which time they usually appear upon the water with the nose to the windward, and betray themselves to the huntsmen by the curling of the water. The futero, which are an amphibious sort of little polecats, are catched after the same manner. I was likewise entertained upon this occasion with the killing of certain little beasts called sifflers or whistlers, with allusion to the wonted way of whistling or whizzing at the mouth of their holes in fair weather. They are as big as hares, but somewhat shorter. Their flesh is good for nothing, but their skins are recommended by their rarity. The savages gave me an opportunity of hearing one of these creatures whistle for an hour together, after which they shot it, to gratify the curiosity I had to see such diversity of animals. They made a diligent search for the holes or dens of the carcajou, and having found some at the distance of 2 or 3 leagues from the fen upon which we were posted, they conducted me to the place. At the break of day we planted ourselves round the holes, with our bellies upon the ground, and left some slaves to hold the dogs a musket shot behind us. As soon as these animals perceived daylight, they came out of their holes, which were immediately stopped up by the savages, and upon that the dogs fetched them up with ease. We saw but 2 of them, which made a vigorous defense against the dogs, but were strangled after a dispute of half an hour. These animals are not unlike a badger, only they are bigger and more mischievous. Though our dogs showed a great deal of courage in attacking the caribou, they betrayed their cowardice the next day in our encounter with a porcupine, which we spied upon a little tree. To obtain the pleasure of seeing the porcupine fall, we cut down the tree, but neither the dogs nor we durst go near it. The dogs only barked and jumped round it, for it darted its long and hard hair like so many bodkins, 3 or 4 paces off. At last we pelted it to death, and put it upon the fire to burn off its darts, after which we scalded it like a pig, took out the entrails, and roasted it. But though 'twas very fat, I could not relish it so well as to comply with the assertion of the natives, who allege that it eats as well as a capon or a partridge. After the turtle doves had all passed over the place, in quest of their southern retreats, the savages offered to send some of their number with canoes to conduct me home, before the rivers and lakes were frozen over. For themselves were to tarry out for the elk hunting, and they imagined that the cold and hardship attending that exercise had made me sick of it the year before. However, we had then a month good before the commencement of the frost, and in that interval of time, they preferred to entertain me with more diverting game than any I had seen before. They proposed to go 15 or 16 leagues further up the country, assuring me that they knew of a certain place that had the most advantageous situation in the world, both for pleasure and profit, and that afforded great plenty of otters, of the skins of which they meant to make a great cargo. Accordingly, we pulled down our huts, and having embarked in our canoes, sailed up the river, till we came to a little lake of 2 leagues in circumference, at the end of which we saw another greater lake, divided from this by an isthmus of 150 paces in length. We pitched our huts at the distance of a league from that isthmus, and some of the savages fished for trouts, while the rest were employed in laying traps for the otters upon the brinks of the lake. These traps are made of 5 stakes placed in the form of an oblong quadrangle, so as to make a little chamber, the door of which is kept up and supported by a stake. To the middle of this stake they tie a string which passes through a little fork, and has a trout well fastened to the end of it. Now, when the otter comes on shore and sees this bait, he puts above half his body into that fatal cage in order to swallow the fish. But he no sooner touches that the string to which 'tis made fast pulls away the stake that supports the door, upon which an heavy and loaded door falls upon his reins and quashes him. During our pilgrimage in that part of the country, the savages took above 250 Canada otters, the skins of which are infinitely prettier than those of Muscovy or Sweden. The best of them, which are not worth 2 crowns in this place, are sold in France for 4 or 5, and sometimes for 10, if they are black and very rough. As soon as the savages had set their traps, they gave orders to their slaves to go round the lake every morning, in order to take out the amphibious animals. After that, they conducted me to the above-mentioned isthmus, where I was surprised to see a sort of a park or fence made of trees, felled one upon another, and interlaced with thorns and branches, with a quadrangular enclosure of stakes at the end of it, the entry of which was very narrow. They gave me to know that they used to hunt harts in that place, and promised to divert me with the shoe as soon as the enclosures were a little mended. In effect, they carried me 2 or 3 leagues off, upon such roads as had nothing on either side but fens and marshes, and after they had dispersed themselves, some on one hand and some on the other, with a dog for every man, I saw a great many harts running to and again in quest of places of safety. The savage that I kept company with assured me that he and I had no occasion to walk very fast, because he had took the straightest and the nearest road. Before us we saw above 10 harts, which were forced to turn back rather than throw themselves into the marsh, of which they could never get clear. At last, after walking a great pace and running now and then, we arrived at the park, and found the savages lying flat upon the ground all round it, in order to shut up the entry of the stake enclosure as soon as the harts entered. We find 35 harts in the place, and if the park had been better fenced, we might have had above 60, for the nimblest and lightest of them skipped over before they came to enter the enclosure. We killed a great many of them, but spared the dams, because they were great with young. I asked of the savages the tongues and the marrow of the harts, which they gave me very readily. The flesh was very fat, but not delicious, excepting some few bits about the ribs. But after all, this was not our only game. For 2 days after, we went a bear hunting, and the savages who spend 3 parts of 4 of their life in hunting in the woods are very dexterous at that exercise, especially in singling out the trunks of the trees upon which the bears nestle. I could not but admire their knowledge in that point, when, as we were walking up and down in a forest, At the distance of 100 paces one from another, I heard one savage call to another, "Here's a bear." I asked him how he knew that there was a bear upon the tree which he knocked with his axe, and they all replied that 'twas as easily distinguished as the print of an elk's foot in the snow. For 5 or 6 times they never missed, for after they had knocked 2 or 3 times upon the trunk of the tree, the bear came out of its hole, and was presently shot. The Canada bears are extreme black, but not mischievous, for they never attack one, unless they be wounded or fired upon. They are so fat, especially in the autumn, that they can scarce walk. Those which we killed were extreme fat, but their fat is good for nothing but to be burnt, whereas their flesh, and above all their feet, are very nice victuals. The savages affirm that no flesh is so delicious as that of bears, and indeed I think they are in the right of it. While we ranged up and down in quest of bears, we had the pleasure of spying some martens and wildcats upon the branches of the trees, which the savages shot in the head to preserve their skin. But the most comical thing I saw was the stupidity of the woodhens, which sit upon the trees in whole flocks and are killed one after another, without ever offering to stir. Commonly the savages shoot at them with arrows, for they say they are not worth a shot of powder, which is able to kill an elk or an hart. I have plied this sort of fowling in the neighborhood of our cantons or habitations in the winter time, with the help of a dog who found out the trees by scent, and then barked, upon which I approached to the tree, and found the fowls upon the branches. When the thaw came, I went 2 or 3 leagues further up the lake, in company with some Canadese, on purpose to see that fowl flap with its wings. Believe me, sir, this sight is one of the greatest curiosities in the world, for their flapping makes a noise much like that of a drummel about, for the space of a minute or thereabouts. Then the noise ceases for half a quarter of an hour, after which it begins again. By this noise we were directed to the place where the unfortunate moorhens sat, and found them upon rotten mossy trees. By flapping one wing against the other, they mean to call their mates, and the humming noise that ensues thereupon may be heard half a quarter of a league off. This they do only in the months of April, May, September, and October, and, which is very remarkable, a moorhen never flaps in this manner but upon one tree. It begins at the break of day, and gives over at 9 o'clock in the morning, till about an hour before sunset, that it flutters again, and continues so to do till night. I protest to you that I have frequently contented myself with seeing and admiring the flapping of their wings without offering to shoot at them. Besides the pleasure of so many different sorts of diversion, I was likewise entertained in the woods with the company of the honest old gentleman that lived in former ages. Honest Omer, the amiable Anacreon, and my dear Lucian were my inseparable companions. Aristotle too desired passionately to go along with us, but my canoe was too little to hold his bulky equipage of peripatetic syllogisms, so that he was even fain to trudge back to the Jesuits, who vouchsafed him a very honorable reception. I had a great deal of reason to rid myself of that great philosopher's company, for his ridiculous jargon and his senseless terms would have frightened the savages out of their wits. Farewell, sir. I am now arrived at once at the end of my game and my letter. I have heard no news from Quebec, where they continue to make mighty preparations for some considerable enterprise. Time will discover a great many things, an account of which I mean to transmit to you by the ships that are to leave this harbor in the end of autumn. I conclude with my usual compliment. Yours, etc. Letter 12. Dated at St. Helens over against Monreal, June 8, 1687. The Chevalier de Vaudreuil arrives in Canada with some troops. Both the regular troops and the militia are posted at St. Helens, in a readiness to march against the Iroquois. Sir, I have such a budget full of news that I know not where to begin. I received letters, but now from Mr. Senelei's office, by which I have advised that orders are sent to Mr. Denonville to allow me to go for France upon my private concerns. No longer since than yesterday, he told me I should have leave to go after the campaign is over. My relations write that the procuring of this letter cost them a great deal of pains, and that the sooner I come to Paris, 'twould be the better for me. The governor arrived at Monreal 3 or 4 days ago, with all the militia of the country, who lie now encamped along with our troops in that island. Mr. Diablemont has been at Quebec this month, with 5 or 6 second-rate ships having sailed from Rochelle thither in 28 days. He brought over with him 10 or 12 companies of marines, who are to guard the colony while we invade the Iroquois Country. 'Tis said that last year Mr. Denonville sent several Canadese that were known and esteemed by the savages, our allies, who live upon the banks of the lakes and the adjacent countries, with orders to engage them to favor our design of extirpating the Iroquois. In the winter, he made magazines of ammunition and provisions, and now he has sent several canoes laden with provisions to Fort Frontenac, and given orders for the building of an infinite number of such boats as I described in my 4th letter for the transporting of our 20 companies of marines. The militia, who are encamped in this island along with our troops, make 1,500 men and are joined by 500 of the converted savages that live in the neighborhood of Quebec and the island of Monreal. The Chevalier de Vaudreuil, who is come from France to command our troops, is resolved to appear in the field, notwithstanding the fatigue of his passage to Canada, and the governor of Monreal is of the same mind. Mr. de Champigni, the intendant of this country, went from hence to Fort Frontenac 2 days ago. The day after tomorrow, Mr. de Denonville means to march at the head of his little army, being accompanied with an ancient Iroquois that is very much respected by the 5 cantons. The history and various adventures of this old gentleman are too tedious to bear a relation in this place. Everybody is apprehensive that this expedition will prove as successless as that of Mr. de la Barre, and if their apprehensions are not disappointed, the king lays out his money to no purpose. For my part, when I reflect upon the attempt we made 3 years ago, I can't but think it impossible for us to succeed. Time will discover the consequences of this expedition, and perhaps we may come to repent, though too late, of our complying with the advice of some disturbers of the public peace who project to enlarge their private fortunes in a general commotion. I lay this down for an uncontested truth, that we are not able to destroy the Iroquois by ourselves. Besides, what occasion have we to trouble them, since they give us no provocation? However, let the event be what it will, I shall not fail upon my return to transmit you a journal of our actions, unless it be that I embark for Rochelle and deliver it myself. In the meantime, believe me to be, Sir, yours, etc. Letter 13, dated at Niagara, August 2, 1687. Representing the unfavorable issue of the campaign made in the Iroquois Country, the discovery of an ambuscade, and the issuing of orders for the author to march with a detachment to the Great Lakes. Sir, it has been a maxim in all ages that the events of things are not always answerable to men's expectations. When men form to themselves a promising prospect of compassing their ends, they frequently meet with the mortification of seeing themselves disappointed. This I speak by way of application to myself, for instead of going for France, pursuant to the contents of the letter I writ to you 2 months ago, I am now obliged to struggle to one end of the world, as you'll find by the following journal of our expedition. We broke up from St. Helens, much about the time I spoke of in my last. Mr. de Champigny went before us with a strong guard, and arrived in a canoe at Fort Frontenac 8 or 10 days before we came up. As soon as he arrived, he sent 200 or 300 Canadese to surprise the villages of Kente and Ganus, which lie at the distance of 7 or 8 leagues from the fort, and are inhabited by a sort of Iroquois that deserved no other usage than what they met with. Our Canadese had no great difficulty in mastering them, for they surprised them when they least thought of any alarm, and brought them prisoners to Fort Frontenac, where they were tied to posts with cords round their necks, hands, and feet. We arrived at the fort on the 1st of July after the encountering of several difficulties among the waterfalls, cataracts, and currents that I formerly described to you in my account of Mr. de la Barre's expedition. We were more perplexed in this voyage than the former, for our boats were so heavy that we could not transport them over land as we did the canoes, but were obliged to drag them up through the impracticable passes with the force of men and ropes. Immediately upon our debarking, I went straight to the fort, where I saw the miserable prisoners in the above-mentioned posture. The sight of this piece of tyranny filled me at once with compassion and horror, but in the meantime the poor wretches sung night and day, that being the customary practice of the people of Canada when they fall into the hands of their enemies. They complained that they were betrayed without any ground, that in compensation for the care they had took ever since the peace to furnish the garrison with fish and venison, they were bound and tied to posts and whipped in such a manner that they could neither sleep nor guard off the flies, that the only requital they met with for procuring to the French a commerce in the skins of beavers and other animals was to be doomed to slavery, and to see their fathers and the ancient men of their country murdered before their eyes. "Are these the French," said they, "that the Jesuits cried up so much for men of probity and honor?" Even the cruelest sort of death that imagination itself can reach would be nothing to us in comparison with the odious and horrible spectacle of the blood of our ancestors that is shed so inhumanely before our eyes. Assuredly, the 5 villages will revenge our quarrel, and entertain an everlasting and just resentment of the tyrannical usage we now meet with. I made up to one of these wretches, that was about 25 years old, and had frequently regaled me in his hut, not far from the fort, during my 6 weeks' service in that place in the year of Mr. de la Barre's expedition. This poor man, being master of the Algonquin language, I gave him to know that I was heartily grieved to see him in that dismal posture, that I would take care to have victuals and drink conveyed to him twice a day, and would give him letters for my friends at Monreal, in order to his being used more favorably than his companions. He replied that he saw and was very well acquainted with the horror that most of the French were affected with, upon the view of the cruelty they underwent, and that he scorned to be fed, or used more civilly than his fellow prisoners. He gave me an account of the manner in which they were surprised, and how their ancestors were massacred, and truly, I do not believe that anyone can be touched with more cutting and bitter reflections than this poor man was, when he recounted the many services he had done the French during the whole course of his life. At last, after many sighs and groans, he bowed down his head and wrapped himself up in silence. Quoique protest narrat, restavant ultima flevit. But this was not the only thing that affected me. When I beheld the misery of these innocent creatures, I saw some young savages of our side burn their fingers with fire in their lighted pipes, which provoked me to thresh them soundly, but I was severely reprimanded for my pains, and confined to my tent for 5 or 6 days, where I only repented that I had not dealt my blows in a double measure. These savages resented the matter so highly that they ran presently to their huts and flew to their fuses in order to kill me. Nay, all that could be done was scarce sufficient to appease them, for the dispute came to that height that they would have left us if it had not been that our men assured them I was drunk, that all the French were prohibited to give me either wine or brandy, and that I should certainly be imprisoned as soon as the campaign were over. However, the poor wretches, the prisoners, were carried to Quebec, from whence they are to be sent to the French galleys. Much about that time, the Sieur de la Forest, one of the Mr. de la Salle's officers, arrived at the fort in a great canoe, being conducted thither by 8 or 10 coureurs de bois. He gave Mr. Denonville to understand that a party of the Helens and the Omamis waited for the Hurons and the Ottawas at the Lake of St. Clair in order to join them and to march with joint forces to the river of the Tsonnontouans, that being the place of their general rendezvous. He added that in the Lake of the Hurons, near Missilimakinac, Mr. de la Durante, assisted by the savages, our allies, had taken an English company conducted by some Iroquois, who had 50,000 crowns worth of goods in their canoes, to be disposed of in exchange with the nations that dwell upon these lakes, as also that Mr. Dolhut had taken another English convoy, being assisted by the Coureurs de Bois and the savages who had shared the former capture, and that he had kept the English and the Iroquois as prisoners, as well as their commander, who was called Major Gregory. In fine, he represented to Mr. de Denonville that 'twas high time for him to set out from Fort Frontenac, if he meant to appear at the general rendezvous where the auxiliary troops sent from the lakes would arrive very speedily. The next day, being the 3rd of July, the Sieur de la Forest embarked again for Niagara and steered to the north side of the lake. At the same time we embarked and stood to the opposite side of the lake, being favored by the calms which in that month are very common. By good luck, our whole body arrived almost at one and the same time in the river of the Tsonnontouans, and upon that occasion the savages, our allies, who draw predictions from the most trifling accident, showed their wonted superstition in taking this for an infallible presage of the utter destruction of the Iroquois, though after all they proved false prophets, as you will find by the sequel of this letter. The same night that we landed, we hauled our canoes and boats out of the water and set a strong guard upon them. This done, we built a fort of stakes or pales, where we left the Sieur d'Orviller with 400 men to guard our shipping and baggage. The next day, a young Canadese called Fontaine Marion was unjustly shot to death. His case stood thus. Having traveled frequently all over this continent, he was perfectly well acquainted with the country and with the savages of Canada, and after the doing of several good services to the king, desired leave from the governor-general to continue his travels in order to carry on some little trade, but his request was never granted. Upon that he resolved to remove to New England, the two crowns being then in peace. The planters of New England gave him a very welcome reception, for he was an active fellow, and one that understood almost all the languages of the savages. Upon this consideration, he was employed to conduct the two English convoys I spoke of but now, and had the misfortune to be taken along with them. Now, to my mind, the usage he met with from us was extreme hard, for we are in peace with England, and besides, that crown lays claim to the property of the lakes of Canada. The next day, we began our march towards the great village of the Tsonnontouans, without any other provisions than 10 biscuits a man, which everyone carried for himself. We had but 7 leagues to march, in a great wood of tall trees, upon a smooth even ground. The Coureurs de Bois, with a party of the savages, led the van, and the rest of the savages brought up the rear, our regular troops and our militia being posted in the middle. The first day the army marched 4 leagues, and the advanced guards made no discovery. The second day our advanced parties marched up to the very fields of the village without perceiving anything, though they passed within a pistol shot of 500 Tsonnontouans who lay flat upon the ground, and suffer them to pass and repass without molestation. Upon their intelligence we marched up with equal precipitation and confusion, being buoyed up with the apprehension that the Iroquois had fled, and then at least their women, children, and superannuated persons would fall into our hands. When we arrived at the bottom of the hill, upon which the ambuscade was placed at the distance of a quarter of a league from the village, they began to raise their wonted cry, which was followed by the firing of some muskets. Had you but seen, sir, what disorder our troops and militia were in amidst the thick trees, you would have joined with me in thinking that several thousands of Europeans are no more than a sufficient number to make head against 500 barbarians. Our battalions were divided into straggling parties, who fell into the right and left without knowing where they went. Instead of firing upon the Iroquois, we fired upon one another. 'Twas to no purpose to call in the soldiers of such and such a battalion, for we could not see 30 paces off. In fine, we were so disordered that the enemy were going to close in upon us with their clubs in their hands, when the savages on our side, having rallied, repulsed the enemy, and pursued them to their villages with so much fury that they brought off the heads of 80 and wounded a great many. In this action we lost 10 savages and 100 French. We had 20 or 22 wounded, in which number was the good Father Angeleran, the Jesuit, who received a musket shot in those parts with Origen chose to lop off, in order to qualify himself for instructing the fair sex without the disturbance of passion or the danger of scandal. When the savages brought in the heads of their enemies to Mr. de Denonville, they asked him why he halted and did not march up. He made answer that he could not leave his wounded men behind, and that he thought it proper to encamp, that the surgeons might have time to dress their wounds. To obviate this pretense, the savages offered to make litters for the transporting of them to the village that lay but a little way off, but our general did not approve of their advice, upon which, notwithstanding his remonstrances, they drew up into a body, and though they consisted of 10 different nations, agreed in a joint resolution of pursuing their enemy, in hope of taking at least their women, their old men, and their children. Our general, being acquainted with their resolution, gave them to know that he earnestly desired they would rest for one day, and not depart from his camp, and that the next day he would burn their villages, and starve them to death by spoiling their crops. But they took this compliment so ill that most of them returned to their own country, remonstrating that the French came out to fetch a walk rather than to wage war, since they would not take the advantage of the best opportunity in the world, that their ardor, like a flash of fire, was extinguished as soon as kindled, that 'twas a fruitless adventure to draw together so many warriors from all parts to burn some huts of bark that the enemy could rebuild in 4 days, that the Tonontuans did not matter the spoiling of their corn, for that the other Iroquois nations were able to supply him, and in fine, that since they had joined the French twice together to no purpose, they would never trust them for the future, in spite of all the remonstrances they could make. Some are of the opinion that Mr. de Denonville ought to have gone farther, and others affirm that 'twas impossible for him to do more than he did. For my part, I shall not venture upon any decision of the matter. Those who sit at the helm are most liable to be perplexed. To pursue the bare matter of fact, we marched next day to the great village, and carried our wounded men upon litters, but we found nothing there but ashes, for the Iroquois had burnt the village themselves by way of precaution. Then we spent 5 or 6 days in cutting down the Indian corn with our swords. From thence we marched to the 2 little villages of the Thegarombis and the Danoncaritawi, which lay about 2 or 3 leagues off. Having done the like exploits there, we returned to the lakeside. In all these villages we found plenty of horses, black cattle, fowl, and hogs. All the country round afforded us a very charming, pleasant, and even prospect. The forests through which we marched were replenished with oak, walnut, and wild chestnut trees. 2 days after we embarked for Niagara, which lay 30 leagues off, and arrived there in 4 days. As soon as the troops had debarked, we employed them in making a fort of pales with 4 bastions, which was finished in 3 days. Here we mean to leave 120 soldiers under the command of Mr. de Berger, with ammunitions and provisions for 8 months. The fort stands on the south side of the Strait of Herrier Lake, upon a hill at the foot of which the lake falls into the Lake of Frontenac. Yesterday, the savages, our allies, took leave of Mr. de Denonville and made a speech after their usual manner, in which, among other things, they insinuated that they were pleased to see a fort so conveniently placed, which might favor their retreat upon any expedition against the Iroquois, that they depend upon his promise of continuing the war till the Five Nations should be either destroyed or dispossessed of their country, that they earnestly desired that part of the army should take the field out of hand and continue in it both winter and summer, for that they would certainly do the same on their part, and in fine, that for as much as their alliance with France was chiefly grounded upon the promises the French made of listening to no proposals of peace till the Five Nations should be quite extirpated, they therefore hoped they would be as good as their word, especially considering that a cessation of arms would sully the honor of the French and infallibly disengage their allies. Mr. de Denonville gave them fresh assurances of his intention to carry on the war, in spite of all the efforts of the Iroquois, and, in a word, protested that he would prosecute this design so vigorously that in the end these barbarians should be either quite cut off or obliged to shift their seats. The general called for me that very day and acquainted me that in regard I understood the language of the savages, I was to go with a detachment to cover their country pursuant to their request. At the same time, he assured me he would inform the court of the reasons that moved him to detain me in Canada, notwithstanding that he had orders to give me leave to go home. You may easily guess, sir, that I was thunderstruck with these news, when I had set myself all along with the hopes of returning to France and promoting my interest, which is now so much thwarted. However, I was forced to be contented, for the greater power bears the sway all the world over. Pursuant to my orders, I made all suitable preparations for my voyage without loss of time. I took leave of my friends, who singled out the best soldiers for me, and made me presents of clothes, tobacco, books, and an infinity of other things, that they could spare without any inconveniency, because they were then upon their return to the colony, which affords everything that one can desire. By good luck, I brought my astrolabe with me from Monreal, which will enable me to take the latitudes of this lake and to make several other useful observations, for in all appearance I shall be out 2 years or such a matter. The men of my detachment are brisk, proper fellows, and my canoes are both new and large. I am to go along with Mr. Dolhut, a Lyons gentleman, who is a person of great merit, and has done his king and his country very considerable services. Mr. de Tonty makes another of our company, and the company of savages is to follow us. Mr. de Denonville will set out for the colony by the north side of the Lake of Frontenac in 2 or 3 days. He designs to leave at Fort Frontenac a number of men and ammunition equal to what he leaves here. I herewith transmit some letters for my relations, which I beg you would convey to their hands. If I meet with any opportunity, I'll send you a journal of my voyage the next year. In the meantime, I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 14. Dated at Missilimakinac, May 26, 1688. The author leaves Niagara and has an encounter with the Iroquois at the end of the land carriage, the after part of his voyage, a description of the country. He arrives at Fort St. Joseph in the mouth of the Lake of Hurons. A detachment of the Hurons arrive at the same place. After an engagement, they set out for Missilimakinac, a strange adventure of Mr. de La Salle's brother. Missilimakinac described. Sir, I am at a loss to determine whether 'tis owing to stupidity or greatness of mind that the loss of my estate, which I infallibly foresee, does not at all affect me. Your letter is but too shrewd a confirmation of my prophecy. However, I cannot but pursue your seasonable advice in writing to court. In the meantime, suffer me to satisfy my promise in presenting you with a relation of my voyages. I embarked at Niagara August 3rd, on board a canoe manned with 8 soldiers of my detachment, and after running 3 leagues against the current of the strait, came that same day to the place where the navigation stops. There I met with the Sire Grisolon de la Tourette, brother to Mr. Dolhut, who had ventured to come from Missilimakinac with a single canoe to join the army. The 4th, we commenced our great land carriage to the southward, being obliged to transport our canoes from a league and a half below the Great Fall of Niagara to half a league above it. Before we got at any beaten or level path, we were forced to climb up 3 mountains, upon which 100 Iroquois might have knocked us all on the head with stones. While we were employed in this transport service, we were alarmed twice or thrice, which cautioned us to keep a strict guard and to transport our baggage with all possible expedition. Nay, after all our precautions, we were forced to leave 1/2 of our baggage about halfway, upon the discovery of 1,000 Iroquois that marched toward us. Do you judge, sir, if we had not some reason to be alarmed, and whether we would stand to sacrifice all to the natural principle of self-preservation? Though indeed we were in danger of losing our lives as well as our baggage, for we had not embarked above the fall 1/4 of an hour when the enemy appeared upon the straight side. I assure you, I escaped very narrowly, for about 1/4 of an hour before, I and 3 or 4 savages had gone 500 paces out of our road to look upon that fearful cataract, and 'twas as much as I could do to get at the canoes before they put off. To be taken by such cruel fellows was to me no trifling thing. Il morir è niente, ma il vivere bruciando en troppo. To die is nothing, but to live in the midst of fire is too much. As for the waterfall of Niagara, 'tis 700 or 800 foot high and half a league broad. Towards the middle of it we descry an island that leans towards the precipice, as if it were ready to fall. All the beasts that cross the water within 1/4 of a league above this unfortunate island are sucked in by the force of the stream, and the beasts and fish that are thus killed by the prodigious fall serve for food to 50 Iroquois, who are settled about 2 leagues off, and take them out of the water with their canoes. Between the surface of the water that shelves off prodigiously and the foot of the precipice, 3 men may cross in a breast without any other damage than a sprinkling of some few drops of water. To return to the story of the 1,000 Iroquois, I must tell you that we crossed the strait with all the vigor we were masters of, and after rowing all night, arrived next morning at the mouth of the lake, which appeared to be indifferent rapid. Then we were secure from all danger, for the Iroquois canoes are so dull and large that they cannot sail near so quick as those made of birch bark. The former are made of elm bark, which is very heavy, and their form is very awkward, for they are so long and broad that 30 men row in them, 2 abreast, whether sitting or standing, and the sides are so low that they dare not venture them upon the lakes, though the wind be very slack. We coasted along the north coast of the Lake of Erie, being favored by the calms, which are in a manner constant in that season, especially in the southern countries. Upon the brink of this lake, we frequently saw flocks of 50 or 60 turkeys, which run incredibly fast upon the sands, and the savages of our company killed great numbers of them, which they gave us in exchange for the fish that we catched. The 25th, we arrived at a long point of land which shoots out 14 or 15 leagues into the lake, and the heat being excessive, we chose to transport our boats and baggage 200 paces over land, rather than coast about for 35 leagues. September 6, we entered the strait of the Lake of Huron, where we met with a slack current of a half a league in breadth, that continued till we arrived in the Lake of St. Clair, which is 12 leagues in circumference. The 8th of the same month, we steered on to the other end, from whence we had but 6 leagues to run against the stream, till we arrived in the mouth of the Lake of Hurons, where we landed on the 14th. You cannot imagine the pleasant prospect of this strait, and of the little lake, for their banks are covered with all sorts of wild fruit trees. 'Tis true, The want of agriculture sinks the agreeableness of the fruit, but their plenty is very surprising. We spied no other animals upon the shore but herds of harts and roebucks, and when we came to the little islands, we scoured them in order to oblige these beasts to cross over to the continent, upon which they, offering to swim over, were knocked on the head by our canoemen that were planted all round the islands. After our arrival at the fort, of which I was ordered to take possession, Mr. Dullhut and Mr. de Tonti had a mind to rest themselves for some days, as well as the savages that accompanied us. This fort, which was built by Mr. Dullhut, was garrisoned upon his own charges by the Coureur de Bois, who had taken care to sow in it some bushels of turkey wheat, which afforded a plentiful crop that proved of great use to me. The garrison surrendered their post very cheerfully to my detachment, and then pursued their commerce with our savages, for every one had leave to go where he pleased. This gave me an opportunity of sending 2 canoes under a guard of soldiers to dispose of a great roll of tobacco of 200 weight that Mr. Dullhut had kindly presented me with. For that honest gentleman informed me that my soldiers might easily purchase corn in exchange for tobacco sooner than for any other commodities. I am obliged to him as long as I live, but I am much afraid the treasurer of the navy will make him no better compensation for this piece of service than for 1,000 other disbursements upon the king's account. The soldiers I sent with the tobacco returned in the latter end of November, and brought with them the Reverend Father Avenel, the Jesuit, who found no occasion to trouble himself with preaching up abstinence from meat in the time of Lent. They brought advice that a party of the Hurons, being prepared to march out of their villages to attack the Iroquois beaver hunters, would speedily repair to the fort to rest themselves. In the meantime, I waited with impatience for the arrival of one Turcotte and 4 more of the Coureur de Bois, who were to come to me in the beginning of December, along with some other huntsmen that Mr. de Denonville had promised to send me. But hearing nothing of him, and our commons being at that time very short, I should have been very much pinched if 4 young Canadas, who were expert huntsmen, had not tarried with me all winter. The above-mentioned party of the Hurons arrived December 2, being headed by one Saint-Souan, who left me his canoe and his baggage to keep till he returned, for he could not possibly continue his navigation longer upon the account that the surface of the water began then to be covered with ice. These savages chose to march overland to the fort of Niagara, where they expected to receive intelligence before they entered the country of the Iroquois. They marched 10 days, i.e. 50 leagues, without seeing one soul. But at last their scouts perceived the footsteps of some huntsmen, which they traced at a great pace for a whole night, the snow being then a foot deep. Towards the break of day they returned, and gave notice to their fellow adventurers that they had discovered 6 huts, with 10 men lodged in each of them. Upon this intelligence the whole party made a halt, in order to paint their faces, to prepare their arms, and to concert proper measures. The attack was so formed that 2 men made softly up to the 2 doors of the huts with their clubs in their hands, to knock down any one that offered to come out, while the rest were employed in firing their pieces. And the action was crowned with wonderful success, for the Iroquois being surprised and shut up in their bark prisons, there was but 2 out of 64 that made their escape, and these 2 being naked and destitute of firearms, could not but perish in the woods. 3 of the Hurons indeed were killed upon the spot, but to atone for that loss, the aggressors carried off 14 prisoners and 4 women. This done, they marched back to my fort with all possible expedition. Among the captive slaves, there were 3 who had made part of the number of the 1,000 Iroquois that thought to have surprised us the year before, when we were employed in the great land carriage at Niagara. They gave us to understand that the fort of Niagara was blocked up by 800 Iroquois, who meaned to appear before my posts without any delay. This troublesome piece of news galled me to the last degree, for fear of being reduced to extremities. and with that view I was a very nice husband of what corn I had left. I was not apprehensive of being attacked by him, for the savages never fight fairly, neither do they ever attempt to pull up pelicidos, but I was afraid that they would starve us by cramping out huntsmen in their due range. However, the Hurons continuing 15 days in my fort to refresh themselves, I used the precaution of engaging them to assist my huntsmen in providing meat. But as soon as they took leave of me in order to return home, our hunting was at an end and the gates were kept shut. At last, finding that my provisions were almost out, I resolved to go to Missilimakinac to buy up corn from the Hurons and the Ottawans. Accordingly, having left some soldiers to guide the fort in my absence, I embarked with the rest of my detachment on the 1st of April with a gentle southeast gale, by the help of which we insensibly crossed the Bay of Sanguinon. That little gulf is 6 hours over, and in the middle of it there are 2 little islands which afford a very seasonable shelter when a wind arises in the crossing over. Before you have crossed this bay, the coast is all along full of rocks and shelves, one of which that I saw was 6 leagues broad, but above it the coast is clean and low, especially towards the Sand River, which lies halfway between that bay and a place called L'Anse du Tonnerre. Now this last place is reckoned 30 leagues off the bay. Having passed that, we had but 30 leagues more to sail, which we did without any danger, by the help of an east-southeast gale that swelled the waves prodigiously. In the mouth of the Helens lake, we met the party of the Hurons that I mentioned before, and 400 or 500 Ottawas, who were bound home, after having spent the winter in hunting of beavers upon the river of Saguenay. Both they and we were forced to lie by in that place for 3 or 4 days, by reason of the ice, after which the lake was cleared, and we crossed it together. When the Hurons came ashore, they consulted amongst themselves how to dispose of their slaves, after which they made a present of one of them to Mr. de Juquero, who commanded in that place, but the poor wretch was presently shot to death. Another of them was presented to the Ottawas, who granted him his life, for such reasons as you would easily apprehend if you were better acquainted with the policy and cunning of that sort of men, whom you now take for beasts. I arrived in this place on the 18th of April, and my uneasiness and trouble took date from the day of my arrival. For I found the Indian corn so scarce by reason of the preceding bad harvests, that I despaired in finding half so much as I wanted. But after all, I am hopeful that 2 villages will furnish me with almost as much as I have occasion for. Mr. Chevalier arrived here May 6, being accompanied with his nephew, Father Anastas, the Recollet, a pilot, one of the savages, and some few Frenchmen, which made a sort of a party-color retinue. These Frenchmen were some of those that Mr. de la Salle had conducted upon the discovery of Mississippi. They give out that they are sent to Canada in order to go to France with some dispatches from Mr. de la Salle to the king, but we suspect that he is dead, because he does not return along with them. I shall not spend time in taking notice of their great journey over land, which by the account they give cannot be less than 800 leagues. Missilimakinac, the place I am now in, is certainly a place of great importance. It lies in the latitude of 45 degrees and 30 minutes, but as for its longitude, I have nothing to say of it, for reasons mentioned in my second letter. 'Tis not above half a league distant from the Helens lake, an account of which, and indeed of all the other lakes, you may expect elsewhere. Here the Hurons and Ottawas have, each of them, a village, the one being severed from the other by a single palisado. But the Ottawas are beginning to build a fort up on a hill that stands but 1,000 or 1,200 paces off. This precaution they were prompted to by the murder of a certain Huron called Sandoir, who was assassinated in the Saguenay River by 4 young Ottawas. In this place the Jesuits have a little house or college adjoining to a sort of a church, and enclosed with pales that separated from the village of the Hurons. These good fathers lavish away all their divinity and patience to no purpose in converting such ignorant infidels. For all the length they can bring them to is that oftentimes they'll desire baptism for their dying children, and some few superannuated persons consent to receive the sacrament of baptism when they find themselves at the point of death. The Coureurs de Bois have but a very small settlement here, though at the same time 'tis not inconsiderable, as being the staple of all the goods that they truck with the south and west savages. For they cannot avoid passing this way, when they go to the seats of the Helens and the Omami, or to the Bay de Pointe, and to the river of Mississippi. The skins which they import from these different places must lie here some time before they are transported to the colony. Missilimakinac is situated very advantageously, for the Iroquois dare not venture with their sorry canoes to cross the strait of the Helens Lake, which is 2 leagues over. Besides that, the lake of the Hurons is too rough for such slender boats, and as they cannot come to it by water, so they cannot approach to it by land, by reason of the marshes, fens, and little rivers, which would be very difficult to cross, not to mention that the strait of the Helens Lake lies still in their way. You can scarce believe, sir, what vast shoals of white fish are catched about the middle of the channel, between the continent and the Isle of Missilimakinac. The Ottawas and the Hurons could never subsist here without that fishery, for they are obliged to travel above 20 leagues in the woods before they can kill any harts or elks, and 'twould be an infinite fatigue to carry their carcasses so far overland. This sort of white fish, in my opinion, is the only one in all these lakes that can be called good, and indeed it goes beyond all other sorts of river fish. Above all, it has one singular property, namely that all sorts of sauces spoil it, so that 'tis always eat either boiled or broiled, without any manner of seasoning. In the channel I now speak of, the currents are so strong that they sometimes suck in the nets, though they are 2 or 3 leagues off. In some seasons, it so falls out that the currents run 3 days eastward, 2 days to the west, 1 to the south, and 4 northward, sometimes more, and sometimes less. The cause of this diversity of currents could never be fathomed, for in a calm they'll run in the space of 1 day to all the points of the compass, i.e., sometimes one way, sometimes another, without any limitation of time, so that the decision of this matter must be left to the disciples of Copernicus. Here the savages catch trouts as big as one's thigh, with a sort of fishing hook made in the form of an awl, and made fast to a piece of brass wire, which is joined to the line that reaches to the bottom of the lake. This sort of fishery is carried on not only with hooks, but with nets, and that in winter as well as in summer. For they make holes in the ice at a certain distance one from another, through which they conduct the nets with poles. The Ottawas and the Hurons have very pleasant fields, in which they sow Indian corn, peas, and beans, besides a sort of citrals and melons, which differ much from ours, and of which I shall take occasion to speak in another place. Sometimes these savages sell their corn very dear, especially when the beaver hunting happens not to take well, upon which occasion they make sufficient reprisals upon us for the extravagant price of our commodities. As soon as I have brought up 60 sacks of corn, each of which may weigh 50 pounds, I am to march with my detachment alone to St. Mary's Fort, in order to engage the Sauteur, or the inhabitants of Sault Ste. Marie, to join the Ottawas, after which we mean to march with joint forces to the country of the Iroquois. Besides these, there's a party of 100 Hurons ready to march, under the command of the great leader Adario, whom the French call the Rat, but they do not march our way. I shall write to you with the first opportunity after my return from this expedition. Perhaps the Jesuits will send your letters for me along with Mr. Denonville's to Fort St. Joseph, where I am to reside. I shall expect their arrival with the utmost impatience. In the meantime, I send you a letter directed to Mr. de Seignelay. the purport of which I have here subjoined. 'Twill be a very sensible obligation laid upon me, if you vouchsafe to believe that I always am, Sir, yours, etc.